Michael Carter stood in the middle of his empty penthouse, unable to breathe. Just 24 hours earlier, he had signed the divorce papers, convinced he was finally free to start a glamorous new life with the younger woman he'd risked everything for. Now the silence inside the luxury home was deafening. The expensive artwork had been removed. The family photographs were gone. Even the wedding portrait that had once hung above the fireplace had disappeared, leaving only a pale outline on the wall. His phone vibrated. It wasn't Olivia. It wasn't Sophia. It was a message from the Carter Holdings Board. Emergency board meeting. Effective immediately, you have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Before he could even process those words, another notification appeared. His bank. Large transactions frozen. Please contact your relationship manager immediately. His hands began to shake. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only wanted a better life, a younger woman, more excitement, more freedom. Instead, in less than a single day, he had lost his wife, his family's trust, his company, and the fortune he'd spent 20 years building. As he slowly sank onto the empty living room floor, one terrifying question echoed through his mind. How had one decision destroyed everything overnight? To understand that, we have to go back to the day the first crack appeared in what everyone believed was the perfect marriage. Michael Carter thought betraying his loyal wife would lead to a happier future with a younger, more exciting woman. But every lie he told pushed him closer to a disaster he never saw coming. By the time he realized what he'd sacrificed, it was already too late, and the people he trusted most were about to make sure he paid the price. For more than a decade, Michael and Olivia Carter had been the couple everyone admired. He was the ambitious CEO who transformed Carter Holdings into one of the city's most respected real estate companies. She was the talented interior designer whose warmth and quiet strength made every room and every person feel at home. Together, they seemed unstoppable. Their photographs appeared in business magazines. Their names filled charity event guest lists. Friends envied their marriage. Employees admired their partnership. Even Michael's father, James Carter, often said that Olivia wasn't just his son's greatest blessing. She was the heart that kept the Carter family together. But appearances have a dangerous way of hiding uncomfortable truths. Because while the world celebrated the Carters as the perfect couple, Michael had already begun living a second life, and every secret has an expiration date. Friday evenings had always belonged to Michael and Olivia. No matter how busy life became, they had promised each other one uninterrupted dinner every week. It was a tradition they had kept for 11 years, until recently. That evening, Olivia carefully placed the final dish on the dining table. Candles flickered softly. Fresh flowers rested beside the expensive bottle of wine they had been saving for a special occasion. She glanced at the clock. 7 o'clock. Michael should have been home. She smiled to herself. "Traffic," she whispered. "He'll be here." By 7:30, the food was beginning to cool. At exactly 7:42 p.m., her phone vibrated. "Michael. Running late. Important dinner with investors. Don't wait up." Olivia stared at the message. It was almost identical to the one he'd sent the previous Friday, and the Friday before that. Still, she chose to believe him. Because trust wasn't something you questioned after 11 years of marriage. It was something you protected. She covered the food again and waited. Across the city, Michael wasn't entertaining investors. He sat beneath the glowing skyline of an exclusive rooftop restaurant. Across from him sat Sophia Bennett, confident, beautiful, young. Everything about her radiated excitement. She laughed as she raised her wine glass. "You know," she said playfully, "when you're with me, you actually smile." Michael laughed. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It's an observation." She leaned forward. "You spend your whole life taking care of everyone else's expectations." Then she lowered her voice. "But with me, you get to be yourself." Michael didn't answer, because a part of him desperately wanted to believe she was right. Back home, Olivia finally sat alone at the beautifully prepared table. She looked at the empty chair across from her. It wasn't the first lonely dinner, but somehow, tonight felt different. She couldn't explain why. A quiet ache settled in her chest, almost like her heart already knew something her mind refused to accept. At 10:18 p.m., the front door finally opened. Michael walked inside, adjusting the sleeve of his tailored navy suit. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "The meeting went longer than expected." Olivia smiled gently. "It's all right." She stepped closer to hug him. Then she paused. A faint scent lingered on his jacket. Sweet perfume, not hers. For a brief second, her smile faded. "Everything okay?" Michael asked. She looked into his eyes. Yes. She wanted to ask about the perfume. Instead, she quietly reheated his dinner. Neither of them noticed that the silence between them had just grown a little wider. But upstairs, after Olivia had fallen asleep, Michael's phone lit up on the nightstand. "Sophia, I already miss you. Heart." His eyes widened. He immediately deleted the message. Then he looked at the woman sleeping peacefully beside him. She trusted him completely, and for the first time, Michael felt something he hadn't expected. Not fear, not regret, guilt. But guilt alone had never stopped anyone from making the same mistake twice.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Mafia-Seoul story for more unforgettable drama like this. Now let's get back to the story.
The weeks that followed looked ordinary to everyone else. To Olivia, they felt increasingly unfamiliar. Michael left home before sunrise. He returned long after sunset. Business dinners became routine. Weekend meetings suddenly appeared on his calendar. Phone calls were taken outside. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, never left his pocket anymore. None of these things proved anything, but together they slowly began forming a picture Olivia didn't want to see. One Saturday morning, she carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the balcony. Michael sat reviewing financial reports on his tablet. "I was thinking," she began carefully. He barely looked up. "Hmm? What if we took a weekend away?" He sighed. "You know how busy things are. You've been saying that for months. I'll make it up to you." "When?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, another notification buzzed on his phone. He turned the screen away before reading it. Olivia noticed. She pretended she hadn't. That afternoon, Michael left again. Another client meeting. At least, that's what he said. But instead of heading downtown, he drove to a luxury shopping district where Sophia was already waiting. She smiled the moment she saw him. "You came." "I said I would." Sophia slipped her hand into his. "How much longer are we supposed to keep hiding?" Michael looked away. "It's complicated." "No." She stopped walking. "It's a choice." Her words stayed with him long after they parted, because deep inside he knew she was right. Every day he delayed making a decision, he was lying to two women instead of one. Yet somehow he convinced himself he still had everything under control. He couldn't have been more wrong. Every year, Carter Holdings hosted an elegant charity gala. For Michael and Olivia, it had always been more than a business event. It was where they celebrated another successful year together. This year felt different from the moment they arrived. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the red carpet. Michael smiled perfectly for every photograph. His arm rested gently around Olivia's waist. To the world, they looked inseparable. But the instant the cameras stopped flashing, his hand slipped away. "I need to greet some investors," he said, before disappearing into the crowd. Olivia watched him leave. For the first time in years, she felt alone in a room filled with hundreds of people. As she mingled with guests, a familiar voice caught her attention. Sophia Bennett had arrived with executives from a luxury fashion company sponsoring the event. Olivia had never met her before, but something about the young woman drew her eyes. Then it happened. Across the ballroom, Michael looked directly at Sophia. She smiled, not politely, not professionally, intimately. Michael answered with a smile of his own before quickly looking away. It lasted barely 2 seconds. No one else seemed to notice. Olivia did. Her stomach tightened. Later that evening, she stepped onto the terrace for fresh air. Just beyond the corner, two familiar voices drifted through the night. "I can't keep waiting forever," Sophia whispered. "You promised." Michael's voice answered quietly. "I'll fix everything." "When?" "Soon." "You always say soon." Olivia's heartbeat thundered inside her chest. She wasn't supposed to hear this, but she couldn't move. A second later, footsteps approached. Panicking, she hurried back inside before either of them turned the corner. When Michael returned to the ballroom several minutes later, his expression was calm. Too calm. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Olivia searched his face. For 11 years, she'd believed she could read every emotion in his eyes. Tonight, she realized she no longer could. As they drove home in silence, one question refused to leave her mind. At that moment, Olivia didn't know the truth, but the conversation she had just overheard was only the beginning. Within weeks, one shocking discovery would destroy her marriage and turn Michael's perfect life into a nightmare. Olivia barely slept after the charity gala. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same moment. Michael's smile, the young woman's smile, and the whispered promise on the terrace. "I'll fix everything." Those 3 words replayed in her mind until dawn. By morning, she convinced herself she was overreacting. Michael had never given her a reason to question his loyalty before. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe the conversation had been about business. She wanted to believe that. She needed to. Michael noticed the distance almost immediately. At breakfast, Olivia smiled politely, but she asked fewer questions. She didn't remind him to take his vitamins. She didn't tease him about drinking too much coffee. She simply watched him, quietly, observing. For the first time, Michael felt uncomfortable in his own home, not because she accused him, because she didn't. Later that afternoon, Emma Brooks visited Olivia's design studio. "You've been quiet since the gala." Olivia hesitated before finally speaking. "I heard Michael talking to another woman." Emma looked up immediately. "What kind of conversation?" "I don't know. I only heard a few sentences, but—" She swallowed. It didn't sound professional. Emma remained calm. "Have you asked him?" "I want to, but I'm afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That he'll tell me the truth." The room fell silent. Emma reached across the desk and gently squeezed Olivia's hand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the hardest answers are the ones we already know." That evening, Michael met Sophia again. She looked frustrated. "I'm tired of hiding." "I told you I'm working on it." "No," Sophia shook her head. "You're protecting yourself." Michael's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly." She stepped closer. "You promised me a future, and every day you go home to your wife." Michael looked away. For the first time, even Sophia's patience was beginning to disappear. As she walked away, she left him with one sentence he couldn't ignore. "You can't keep two lives forever, Michael." He watched her disappear into the crowd. Deep down, he knew she was right. He just didn't realize how quickly both lives were about to collide. Meanwhile, at home, Olivia opened Michael's closet while putting away freshly cleaned suits. As she hung one jacket, something fell from the inside pocket, a restaurant receipt. She picked it up. It wasn't from an investor lunch. It was from the luxury rooftop restaurant. 2 dinners, 2 desserts, a bottle of expensive wine. The date, the exact same Friday night he had claimed to be entertaining investors. Olivia's hands began to tremble. She stared at the receipt. One receipt wasn't proof, but it was enough to destroy the last piece of certainty she still had. As tears slowly filled her eyes, one painful realization settled over her. The man she trusted most had started becoming a stranger. Olivia still didn't know the whole truth, but the receipt in her hands was the first piece of a puzzle that would soon expose every lie Michael had been hiding. And the next clue would be impossible to explain.
For the next several days, Olivia said nothing. She carefully placed the receipt back into Michael's jacket, exactly where she'd found it. She didn't want him to know she had seen it. If there really was an explanation, she wanted him to offer it willingly. Instead, Michael unknowingly made an even bigger mistake. Carter Holdings was preparing for one of the biggest investment deals in company history. Michael's schedule became even busier. Meetings filled every hour. Conference calls stretched late into the evening. To everyone else, he looked like a successful CEO under pressure. Only Michael knew he wasn't just balancing billion-dollar negotiations. He was balancing 2 completely different lives, and both were beginning to collapse. Late one evening, Michael stepped into the shower after returning home. For the first time in months, he left his phone charging on the nightstand, unlocked. Olivia wasn't looking for it. She had no intention of invading his privacy. Then, the screen lit up. A message appeared. "Sophia, heart. I miss you already. Last night felt like the beginning of our future." Olivia froze. She stared at the glowing screen. Her heartbeat echoed through the quiet bedroom. With trembling fingers, she picked up the phone. She didn't have to search. The messages were already there. Dinner reservations, private photographs, promises, vacation plans. "I'll tell Olivia soon. I love you. I'm counting the days until we're finally together." Each message struck harder than the last. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too painful. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept reading. Because once the truth begins, you can't choose how much of it you'll discover. When Michael stepped out of the bathroom, he immediately knew something was wrong. Olivia stood near the window. His phone rested in her hands. Neither of them spoke. The silence lasted several unbearable seconds. Then Olivia asked only one question. "How long?" Michael closed his eyes. He had rehearsed countless excuses in his mind over the past several months. Every one of them disappeared. 8 months. The words landed like a hammer. Olivia nodded slowly. No screaming, no insults, only heartbreak. "I believed every lie." Michael stepped forward. "Olivia." She took one step back. "Don't." For the first time since they met, Michael saw something he'd never imagined seeing in her. Not anger, disappointment, and somehow that hurt even more. Michael thought confessing would end the lies. Instead, it marked the beginning of consequences neither he nor Sophia were prepared to face. The next morning, the Carter mansion felt colder than ever. Olivia had spent the entire night awake, not crying, thinking. By sunrise, she had reached a decision. When Michael entered the kitchen, she calmly placed her wedding ring on the table. His heart stopped. "What are you doing?" She looked directly into his eyes. "I can't stay married to someone who stopped choosing me 8 months ago." "Olivia, please. I made mistakes." "No." She shook her head. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is coming home late. You built another relationship while coming home to your wife every night. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice." Michael couldn't answer, because every word was true. Later that day, Olivia quietly packed a suitcase. She didn't take expensive jewelry, she didn't take designer handbags, she only packed what belonged to her. As she reached the front door, Michael stood in her way. "I'll end it with Sophia." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "You should have ended it before it began." She gently stepped around him. The front door closed behind her, and just like that, the house that had once been full of laughter became painfully silent. Olivia drove straight to Emma's home. Emma opened the door. One look at Olivia's face was enough. Without saying a word, she wrapped her friend in a hug. For the first time since discovering the affair, Olivia allowed herself to cry. Not because she still believed Michael would change, but because she was grieving the man she thought she'd married. Across town, Michael sat alone inside the empty dining room, the same dining room where Olivia had once waited for him with candlelit dinners. Now only one untouched plate remained. For the first time, he understood what loneliness actually felt like. But before he could gather his thoughts, his phone rang. The caller ID read, "James Carter."
Michael answered. "Hello, Dad." James's voice was calm. "I've just heard something very disturbing." Michael's stomach tightened. "What have you heard?" "I'd rather ask you myself." A long pause followed. Then James asked the question Michael had feared more than any other. "Tell me, son, is it true you've thrown away your marriage for another woman?" Michael closed his eyes, because he knew his private betrayal was no longer private, and once his father learned the full truth, the consequences would reach far beyond his marriage. Michael believed losing Olivia was the worst thing that could happen. He was wrong, because the next person he would have to face wasn't just his father. It was the man who had built the Carter family legacy and who was about to decide whether Michael deserved to remain part of it. James Carter had built Carter Holdings from a single office into one of the most respected real estate companies in the country. To him, success had never been measured by money alone. It was measured by character. And as Michael walked into his father's private study that afternoon, he knew this conversation had nothing to do with business. James remained seated behind his old mahogany desk, his wooden cane resting beside him. For several long moments, neither man spoke. Finally, James broke the silence. "Tell me everything." Michael lowered his eyes. "There isn't much to explain." James' expression hardened. "Then I'll make it simple." He leaned forward. "Did you betray your wife?" A heavy silence filled the room. "Yes." "How long?" 8 months. James slowly closed his eyes. When he opened them again, disappointment had replaced anger. "You inherited my company. You inherited my name. But somewhere along the way, you forgot what it means to deserve either." Michael swallowed hard. "I made a terrible mistake." James shook his head. "No, a mistake happens once. You lied every day for 8 months. Those were choices." Each word struck harder than the last. Then James delivered the sentence Michael never expected to hear. "Until the board completes its investigation, you will step away as CEO." Michael looked up in disbelief. "Dad, this isn't punishment. It's accountability. The company cannot be led by a man whose judgment has collapsed." For the first time in his career, Michael realized he was no longer in control. Across town, Olivia slowly settled into Emma's guest room. The house felt unfamiliar, but strangely peaceful. Emma placed a cup of tea beside her. "How are you feeling?" Olivia looked out the window. "I keep wondering what I did wrong." Emma answered immediately. "You didn't." "But if I had been more exciting, if I'd worked less, if I'd noticed sooner." Emma gently interrupted. "Someone else's betrayal is never proof that you weren't enough. It's proof that they stopped appreciating what they already had." Those words stayed with Olivia long after Emma left the room. For the first time since discovering the affair, she stopped blaming herself. And that became the first step toward healing. Meanwhile, Sophia called Michael repeatedly. This time, he didn't answer. Her messages became increasingly desperate. "What's happening? Why aren't you calling me? You promised we'd finally be together." But Michael had no answers left to give. The fantasy they had built together was beginning to crumble, and reality was arriving much faster than either of them expected. Michael thought losing his marriage was the price of his affair. He had no idea he was about to lose something he had spent 20 years building, because the next board meeting would change his life forever.
The Carter Holdings boardroom had never felt so cold. Every director sat in silence. James Carter occupied his usual seat at the head of the table. Michael entered confidently. He still believed he could fix everything. After all, he had survived difficult negotiations before. This would be no different, or so he thought. James stood. The board has completed its review. Michael nodded. I understand. No, James replied calmly. I don't believe you do. He looked around the room. Our clients invest in this company because they trust its leadership. Leadership begins with integrity. Several board members quietly nodded. The investigation found no financial misconduct. Michael exhaled in relief. But James wasn't finished. However, the board unanimously agrees that your recent conduct has severely damaged confidence in your leadership. A long silence followed. Then came the decision. Effective immediately, you are removed as Chief Executive Officer of Carter Holdings. Michael stared in disbelief. The words barely registered. 20 years of relentless work, gone, just like that. Outside the building, Sophia waited inside a luxury cafe. When Michael arrived, she smiled. So, you're finally free. Michael sat down slowly. I lost the company. Her smile disappeared. What? The board removed me. Sophia blinked several times. You mean temporarily? No, it's over. Silence filled the table. Then, for the first time, Michael noticed something changing in Sophia's expression. Concern quickly replaced by disappointment. She looked at him differently now, not as the powerful CEO she'd fallen for, but as a man whose future had suddenly become uncertain. Several days later, Michael called Sophia again. No answer. He tried once more. Straight to voicemail. Hours later, one final message appeared. I think we both need different things from life. That was it. No goodbye, no explanation. The woman he had sacrificed everything for walked away the moment everything disappeared. Michael slowly lowered his phone. Only then did he understand. He hadn't lost Olivia because Sophia was better. He had lost Olivia because he had stopped valuing the woman who had loved him long before success ever arrived. And now, both women were gone. For the first time in months, Michael had nothing left to lose. But while his world continued falling apart, 6 months passed. Olivia's design studio had grown beyond anything she once imagined. New clients arrived through recommendations. Her confidence returned one project at a time. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer controlled her. One afternoon, Emma smiled as they finished celebrating another successful project. Have you noticed something? Olivia laughed. What? You smile again. Olivia paused. She hadn't realized it. Emma was right. For months, surviving had been enough. Now, she was living again. Meanwhile, Michael lived alone in a luxury apartment that no longer felt luxurious. Without Carter Holdings, without Olivia, The silence followed him everywhere. He often found himself staring at old family photographs, pictures of vacations, anniversaries, Sunday breakfasts, small moments he had once taken for granted. He finally understood something success had hidden from him. The most valuable things in life are often the easiest to overlook until they're gone. One rainy afternoon, Michael visited the small cafe where Olivia often worked between client meetings. When she saw him, she remained calm. He approached slowly. "You look happy." She smiled politely. "I've found peace." Michael nodded. "I'm glad." Several seconds passed. Then he spoke again. "I'm sorry. I know saying that doesn't change anything, but I'm sorry." Olivia looked at him with kindness. Not love, not anger, just kindness. "I believe you're sorry." Michael's eyes filled with regret. "Is there any chance?" She gently shook her head before he could finish. "The man I loved stopped choosing our marriage long before I left. I'm not angry anymore, but I've finally learned something." "What?" "You can forgive someone without giving them another chance to hurt you." Michael lowered his head. He understood. This wasn't revenge, it was closure. As Olivia walked away, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some chapters are meant to be remembered, others are meant to be closed forever. Michael watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Only then did he fully understand the title of his own story. He hadn't lost everything the day Olivia left. He had lost everything the day he chose to betray the one person who had stood beside him before wealth, power, and success. By the time he realized her true worth, she had already built a beautiful life without him. And that was the greatest consequence of all. Betrayal rarely destroys a life in a single moment. It happens one lie, one broken promise, and one selfish decision at a time. Trust takes years to build, but only seconds to break. And while success, money, and status can be rebuilt, the love of someone who gave you their whole heart is not always waiting when you decide you're ready to return. If this story reminded you of the importance of loyalty, honesty, and valuing the people who truly stand by you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from watching someone else lose everything they once took for granted.